Got him! What's up guys? Nick the Informative Fisherman here. Today I'm going to be showing you a little secret breakdown about how I use floats for bank fishing and catching panfish really fast with some tried, true, and proven methods. And I'm going to show you how to do it on July and August's Lucky Tackle Box panfish boxes. This is all stuff, if you're subscribed to Lucky Tackle Box, that you should have, and be how to effectively use it and start catching panfish like this and a lot bigger. So let's break it down. All right guys, now for this method, this is a fan casting system that I've used for years with a bobber and a micro jig to get started off to find the panfish. Then I'll switch to other methods once I have them tracked down. But this is a really fast way to do it from the bank. Now I use an assortment of floats, but the float I use primarily bank fishing is a long range float. This is called a rocket bobber. This thing is so aerodynamic and can carry a micro jig. I've probably casted this thing 140 to 160 foot range consistently, and you can do that with really light line and a little micro jig to find them from the bank. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off and I'm going to picture the area in front of me, okay? And I want to lay it out in a grid, but how do I lay it out in a grid in my mind? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look in the water and I'm going to see about how far I can see down, what depth I can see down to. So I'm going to look in my water right here and I say probably 3.5, 4 feet. And the reason why, a lot of the fish do not like to be in crystal clear water unless there's cover or structure or shade right there. Then they will be there, but that's a target. But this is how I set a generalized depth from the bank right when I'm first getting started. The fish like to be on that transition where you can't quite see them, but it's shaded, there's cover down there. It's a good happy medium. Right about how far you can see down is where you want to set that float. Now from there, with that same depth that you can see down, you want to times it by 3. And what I mean by times 3, let's say I could see 3 feet down. So now I want to separate my cast times 3, that's 9 feet apart. So I want to start here, I'm going to go another 9 feet, another 9 feet, another 9 feet, another, and another, and another. And this is how this grid is going to be laid out. At the same time, I also want to start right in front of me. So I have an inside grid, so I'm going to cast 20 feet out in front of me, 20 feet, 20 feet, 20 feet, separated by 9 feet at a time until I get bit. Once I get bit, I'm going to keep trying to catch them. If they're too small on a micro jig, I'm going to grab something to upsize, and we'll get into that with the products that comes into the Lucky Tackle Box. So let me start breaking apart my grid right now. 20 feet out there, 9 feet over, another 20 feet. You always want to start to the inside of you. As long as you start to the inside, you could effectively catch fish here before you catch fish out there and pull them through your group. Alright, so I casted about 20 feet out in front of me, separated from about 9 to 10 feet each cast. Didn't get bit, so now I'm going to start probably about 40 feet from me, and I'm going to do the identical thing. I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit, let my float hit, let the ring settle around it. If nothing pounces on it right away, I'm going to give it about 5 or 6 seconds. I'm not trying to be in the water a long time. If I got that duck right around the neck. If you throw it out there and count to about 5 or 6 and you don't get bit, more than likely there's not active bluegills, there's not active shell crackers, or there's not active crappie. So move right on to the next spot. Separate it about 10 feet over, throw it about 40 feet out, and I'm going to do this fan casting grid. Here, 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 here. I'm going to go a little farther out. Here, 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 here. And you will pretty much, right there, see that? Now, that bite that I just got right there on that bobber was a very slow, methodical grab. And I'm going to explain to you, that was a crappie that just bit that float right there. And I'll tell you how to differentiate the difference between shell crackers, bluegills, and crappie on their bite. I know some of you fish for yellow perch, but we don't have them here in Northern California. So I don't have a lot of experience with yellow perch, but I'm going to tell you how to know the difference between the 3 others with a strike. So now I know right out here to this part of my fan cast about 40 feet out that I got bit by a crappie. So I'm going to keep actively searching. Now I know where there is a crappie. More than likely it was a very small one because he didn't get my jig, but by the way he grabbed it, I can tell exactly what it was. And that's with about 75–80% accuracy. Every now and then there's that one random fish that wants to just do something weird, and yeah, it'll tell you something different. But this is with all fishing. Everything's an educated guess. And as you keep making these educated guesses, you're going to eliminate what's not working that day, and you're going to be able to figure out what is working. Now, I often get asked why I rig my float sideways and let it float and I don't add weight right here. When a rocket bobber is sitting in the water, laying on its side, crappie have a really sensitive grab. Sometimes a crappie will swim up and it'll grab your jig and just sit there. A rocket bobber will kind of just tilt up like that, or it'll do a weird little twist. Anything odd means a fish came up and grabbed it. If you have weight on your line and they come and lift up and your weight's still right here, your float will not move. It will not show you a strike if the fish swims up and grabs it and swims up. It won't show you the strike until they turn around and create tension on your line to dip it at that point. But if there's no weight on your float, it's going to sit sideways, and anything that touches your line, it's going to spin, it's going to partially tilt, it's going to give you that extra sensitive indication that you need a lot of the time when fishing for crappie. Bluegill and shellcracker, that weight on the bottom, they're usually pretty aggressive and fast, and you'll notice right away. But I love to fish it laying down. Sometimes it leads to more line twists, but I'm going to also show you how to take care of that. Alright guys, so I made my inside grid fan cast, went around, I got the one bite from that crappie, and I'm probably going to re-hit that area. Now I'm looking for like that 60–70 foot range, and I'm doing those same fan casts, and then I'm going to go much farther to get an indicator of where there's bluegill, where there may be more crappie, where there may be a red ear, and I'm going to show you how to adjust from there. So I got no bite there, so I'm going to make my next fan cast right out there. There we go, guys. About probably 85 to 100 foot range. That fan cast, I'm hooked up. It's definitely something small. But I found what I believe to be an area that's holding crappie. And now an area, this is a juvenile shellcracker right here. And I'll tell you what I've done too. Now I'm going to show you that I have a much longer leader now. So I'm running about a 4.5–5 foot long leader from my float to my my little jig down there. And the reason why that is I made the same cast that I just made right in the middle of my grid at my 12 o'clock, boom, straight out from me, close to 100 foot in range. And you can easily make this cast that I'll show you how shortly here. What happened is I kept getting bam, bam. I see my float getting hit, but they weren't keeping it down. A lot of the time that's an indicator of you're not fishing deep enough. If you see the float getting hit and not staying down, giving you enough time to set the hook, that means they're swimming up high to where they're uncomfortable. They're swatting at it as fast as they can and trying to come back down deeper. If you get that indication, you get hit in a spot a couple times where it doesn't go down, it's not necessarily the fish are too small to get it. A lot of the time it's that they're traveling so far up, they're uncomfortable, and they're hitting it and coming back down immediately. To where if you set your dropper longer, a lot of the time you can catch those fish. So let's see if I can make a repeat. So I've made that exact same cast back out to the spot. My float landed, I counted to about 5 or 6. I have no strikes. Now, since I know that I just caught a fish there, oh, and it just went down, oh, and I just missed them, I'm going to spend more time in that spot because I know I just caught a fish there. Now, a thing we like to do is called dancing, to where I'll shake the rod tip just enough to where I'm trying to vibrate my float, just to where I know that little jig under it's going to just get partial movements. You always want to start off with subtle movements. You know, a lot of the time if the water's real dirty, you can pop it a little harder. The fish will hear it and come over and find your bait. But if the water's cleaner, you want very, very subtle movements on that float. A little ring in the water just to get the fish looking up. Not to spook them, just to give them an indicator that there's something there. Once they get closer, they'll find your jig. Alright guys, when it comes to the casting, the reason why I'm using the rocket bobbers is extremely aerodynamic and it's weighted. And for bank fishing, you can cast this thing 100–150 feet pretty darn easy. I'm using ultralight tackle, 4-pound line, and a very light jig. It's important that you don't use a real snappy, jerky cast. Just a smooth lob. I can easily throw that thing 80 to 100 feet out there with absolute ease, which is very, very critical for light line and pan fishing. You don't want to have to muscle it out there. Muscling's using heavier gear. We don't need to do this. We're using light jigs, light line, the rocket bobber. Being able to bank fish and make 100-foot plus cast is super, super vital if you're trying to track down fish from one location. Now I want to show you guys something that's also extremely critical to float fishing. It's pretty windy out here today. We probably got 12 to 15 mile an hour winds. So if I make a long cast, there's going to be a lot of wind pushing against my line, which is going to leave a big bow in the line. Therefore, when a fish takes down my float, I have to reel in a lot of slack before I can make contact with the fish. I'm going to show you how to keep a tight line at a long range cast when you're dealing with wind. I'm going to make a cast and my hand is going to be loosely right here against the side of the spool, and all I'm doing is creating tension on the line coming off in between the rod, the reel, and my float. So I'm going to make this cast, and I'm going to put my hand right there, and I'm creating tension to where my line now is directly straight out there to my float. I don't have a big bow to where now if I reel once, boom, I immediately make my float move, and I know I'm in direct contact to where if that float dives down quick, I can easily set the hook on that fish without reeling and setting the hook on slack line and missing. All right guys, another thing when you're float fishing, as you make that cast, you feather your spool, you want a tight line going to your float. And the easiest way to tell if you have a tight line, if you can make half a rotation of your reel and that float moves, you're good. If you can make a full rotation, you have too much slack. Half a rotation of your spinning reel and your float moves, you have just enough tight line. Now here's a real critical factor, and I'll tell you this, and you can watch your buddies if you're out float fishing, or you can try it yourself. If they don't make that tight line before they set the hook as that bobber goes down, if the bobber goes down and you didn't have that tight line, you're going to miss 50% of your strikes. Another way to greatly increase from not missing strikes is as that float goes down, you want your rod tip in a down position, start to reel, make sure you have a tight line, and then set the hook on the fish. Your hookup ratio will be so much higher if you have that tight line going to your float. As it lands, you don't want to tow your float back to you. You don't want to pull your float back to you. You want to keep the float exactly where it lands, but you want to get your line as tight as possible without moving that float. And as that fish strikes it, you want to reel and then set the hook at the exact same time. And your hookup ratio is going to go through the roof, I can promise you that. All right guys, so since we were out there casting off my back dock, we came back into my kitchen. The humidity is crazy and I'm sweating so bad it was ridiculous. So let's see how we can use what's in the July box and August box of the LTB Panfish boxes to properly utilize that technique out back. Let's take out the cards and let's lay out all the good. There's an open jig right there. All right, so that is the July box, and we'll go over that stuff. Let's see what we got in the August box. Koozie. All right, let's see here. We have everything here. So if we want to continue float fishing, I'm going to look at immediately things that'll work under a float. And I'm going to separate the things that don't work under a float. Okay, so immediately we have the rival worm. That's that double hooked purple worm right there. That'll definitely work under a float. It's got a pre-rig leader though, so I'll show you what we have to do there. We have these little local bait and tackle. They're like a little tiny beetle. Basically, they're just like a little nub plastic that don't have any appendages. And believe it or not, these things are coming on the fishing scene in a big way. A lot of microorganisms and microlife that live in lakes take this shape. They're just a lot smaller. So panfish are used to feeding on bait in this identical shape. From there, crappie bait eggs. This is a biodegradable protein egg right here. This is made by Magic Products. This is like a bait attachment. Even though I did cast one of these on just a hook and I did catch a fish on it, this is where you would want to take something like a bigger crappie jig like so and put one of those little eggs on there. These are going to be really good for crappie fishing. I haven't noticed them making a big difference on bluegill or red ears, but in regards to crappie fishing, adding little scent things like little nugget things and these little ball things here can add a substantial amount of fish biting your jig right there. The Jenko fishing, what are these guys called right here? The Fry series. It's like a juvenile crappie shape right there. Very, very common. It's like a baby fry is what they're referred to, just a fry fish. And you can see that shape right there. They got the one little display one, which is pretty cool. Good thinking for their packaging. Now, pink is a color that is kind of synonymous. Pink and chartreuse are really synonymous with crappie fishing. And they're kind of like an extreme color. What I generally start off with, if the water's clean, I'll start off with like a really natural pattern, like a brown. And then if I'm not getting bit, sometimes I'll throw out an extreme pattern like a pink or a chartreuse. If it's bright and sunny and the water has a little green tint to it, like a chartreuse color tends to work really well. But a lot of the time the crappie will just key in on pink. So don't be afraid to throw that. Also, Crave baits, the little pink grub right here. These look like 2-inch pink grubs or 2.5-inch pink grubs. Pink grubs are phenomenal for all panfish, also including trout. Grubs are really, really good for trout. They're good for bass too, so this is a very versatile bait. And I'll show you what jig head you guys want to put these on too. Then we have the garbage bait, the worm buffet. This is just like a little straight brown worm. Now, believe it or not, you know, everybody thinks, oh, if it's just a little tiny straight worm without appendages, it's not gonna get bit. You look at the Senko, the Yamamoto Senko, in regards to bass fishing, probably the #1 worm in the country, has 0 appendages. It strictly has ridges, and it'll have attracting value on the fall, where it's going to kind of just undulate and look just very natural and subtle, that a lot of the time is going to catch those fish on those calmer, cleaner days where the bite's tough. So you need to think about this the same way. Brown, very natural, clean, calm water. This will probably excel. You're going to get more action out of a non-appendage bait fishing it on the lightest jig head you can. So using a bobber like I was showing you out back, and using a very light jig head on this, or even without a jig head, just threaded up a worm, threaded up that hook like that, is probably just enough weight to get it to slowly fall. The slower the fall on a slicker, calmer, cleaner water day, the more bites you're going to get versus a fast fall. Oh, here we go. I already took 2 of these out. These are the Whip R Ultimate Micro Lures. I gotta put this in my hand so you can see it right here. Let me take it out, and then I'll let you get a better look at that, because this is a very tiny one. And remember when I said out back, when you want to start off float fishing, you want to start off with a micro jig. You're strictly trying to get bit by everything. You're not necessarily looking for size. I found crappie, and I found red ear and a bluegill in the same school, and I found a crappie in a different spot. So now I can adjust my bait selection according to my distance and location and species. But that little micro jig right there has already caught me a ton over the last couple days, doing the exact technique. And if you're just bringing out kids to fish doing that float method like I was showing you off the dock, that little micro jig right there could be all you need, because everything will bite it. Fish from this big, from fish to that big. Everything's going to eat this small natural appendage. And when the sun's up, chartreuse is going to excel. I noticed chartreuse doesn't get bit nearly as often in low light hours, but when that sun is up, it gets bit a lot. All right, guys, now let's look at 3 of the unique things that came in these boxes. I have the Divinator, which is a biwa, basically a swim bait with a spinner tail, little Colorado spinner tail on the back. This is the exact bait that I was using, but I was using it in a blue or a white. This is a pure chartreuse, so like I was saying, if the water's got a little bit of green to it, or it's a bright sunny day, that chartreuse is going to work really well. I was at a Clear Lake smashing the crappie on this. This thing is phenomenal for casting. It's a little heavier of a reaction bait, but for like crappie and yellow perch or even trout, that can be fantastic from a boat or from the bank fishing. Here's another one. This is the Brim Spin by Reaction Strike. I'm actually going to take this out of there. I'm going to show you guys something on this. So this is basically just an inline spinner, you know, like a traditional inline spinner, but it looks to be like a size 8 hook on the back, which is a much smaller hook than normal. So you can catch panfish on the back of a spinner, because I'm sure you've seen, if you've ever been out trout fishing casting a spinner, I'm sure you've seen bluegills and other panfish come up and hit it. One little tip I'm going to offer you, right on this back hook, you could thread like a little tiny grub on the back to increase the focal point on that hook, and I'll show you that. But that's also going to increase the hookup ratio, because sometimes they're going to come up and they're going to slap at that blade. But if you put a little tiny plastic on that hook, that's going to get them to come up from the attention from the blade, and then they're going to focus and bite that hook. Now, really cool with all these plastics, here's a bait haze Dippin' Dust. This is garlic. I'm not going to open it in my kitchen. It'll probably go everywhere. It's like a powder. So let's say you have a bait rigged up on the end of your line, okay, and it's wet. You can leave this open on the front of your boat or on the bank, and you can dip your wet bait into there. And what that's going to do is it's going to add a lot of that garlic scent to it and flavor, to where now when you cast your jig out and it hits the water, a cloud of food and dust and bait scent's going to fall off. And panfish are extremely attracted to scent and flavors and bait. This is why a lot of people just use worm and catch them so well. Worms, you know, and other little tiny pieces of bait. But that little dust right there, by just leaving it in front of you, dipping your little wet jig in there, it's going to cover it. When it hits the water, it's going to send out a cloud of food. They're going to come looking, and then they're going to find your jig. So in regards to float fishing out back, these are a little too big and beefy to fish under a float, and they only work as the bait's being retrieved. So these are a cast and reel in retrieval style reaction bait. So those fish that I found around 100 feet, this could be very hard to get to that range. The lighter line you use and the longer rod you use, you can get the cast out there farther. You might be able to make that longer range of a cast on a light spinning rod with 4-pound line. The heavier line you go, the shorter your cast is going to be. So you might be able to place these where I got out to the crappie at around 40 to 60 feet. I will try both of these to see if I can get a crappie to eat these. Otherwise, my longer range spot, I'm going to have to get into a boat and get closer to that, or just primarily fish the float on that spot. Alright guys, now for the crave grub, the local tackle beetle, the garbage baits worm buffet, the Jenko baby fry, and the rival worm. These are all things you can rig under the float, but there is other options for rigging them. I have my little jig box right here with also bladed jigs via micro chatterbaits or spinners or underspins or prop style heads. Now there's an assortment of things you can do with these, but in regards to rigging them under a float, you're pretty much going to want to use the lightest jig head possible. Now, if you think about rigging a grub under a float, you got to remember, if you pull the float, the line's going to pendulum out from behind it back under. So how I would work a grub under a float is I would cast it to my spot, I would let it fall. If I don't get bit, I'm going to pull my float up a couple feet at a time, which is going to force that line to pendulum, and then that tail's going to kick. That's how I use a grub under a float. So I generally am going to use a 1/32 ounce jig head in regards to rigging a grub, and I'll stick that on and show you. So I have it rigged on that slightly heavier jig head. Now the reason for a slightly heavier jig head is that as I jerk that float forward, this jig head's going to want to catch up faster, which is going to give that tail more of a kick. It's going to look like it's darting, pausing, darting, and pausing. That's going to get you a lot of bites like that. Now, for the garbage worm, I'm going to probably want to throw this on a 1/64 ounce jig head. A little tiny guy like this. That 1/64 comes in so many different variations, but in regards to if you have just like that flat little lead head right there, and a brown combination, I'll often take out a Sharpie and paint that black. That black and brown combination tend to get the extra bite, and a lot of juvenile crustaceans also have black highlights in them. You can put this on a slightly heavier jig head if you just want to hop it across the bottom. If your bottom has rocks, like probably up to 1/32, I wouldn't go much heavier on this. It's thinner and very natural, so you want to keep that slower, natural presentation to it, and don't go too bulky of a jig head, but that can work great under a float. You can wacky rig it, hook it right in the middle and fish that under a float, or you can do a slightly lighter jig head. Not so light, not 1/64, because you can't really cast that, but a 1/32 and 1/16, you can cast that and work that across the bottom quite well. Now, for the little beetle, this is a little bulkier, so there's a couple of things to think of. Under a float, you can fish that on a lighter jig head, but since I said this shape resembles a lot of bottom crustaceans, you can fish this up to an 1/8 ounce and everything lighter. That little faster twitch and just holding a tighter line with a heavier jig head on the bottom, this thing's going to kind of just like shimmy around and look very natural working its way across the bottom. So more than likely, if I'm not fishing that under a float, I'm probably going to put it on 1/8 ounce jig head and work it across like a rocky or dirt bottom, not necessarily grass. If there's grass, I'm always fishing a float. With that rival worm, it already has a leader attached to it. So what you're going to have to do if you want to fish it under a float is tie like a uni knot directly to the loop of that leader, because it has 2 hooks in it. This will work great under a float. It's a longer worm. The weight of the 2 hooks already in it's going to help that worm slowly fall and undulate below. The same thing with the shad. It doesn't have a kicking appendage. It's a straight tail appendage behind it. So a little lighter jig head, it's going to just glide down, and you can do just like you do with the grub and jerk that float forward and get that to come down. It's more subtle. It's going to get you more bites. But the one thing I really like to do with these, and if you've been subscribed to Lucky Tackle Box Panfish Box for a while, I'm sure you've received micro chatterbaits. And this is an awesome micro chatterbait trailer. I love putting that on there, and I love putting grubs on there at the same time. With the straight tail, you can use so many different variations. I even got this jig head in an LTB Panfish box, and this is the spinning jig head right here. It's a spinning head on there. Also works phenomenally well with the straight tail plastic as a trailer behind it, like so. Looks like a juvenile bait fish coming through the water. You're going to get a lot of bites. These straight tail shad presentations, the fry shad like that, work phenomenal. You can use them on the little creek spins. I love that straight tail combination with any sort of spinner. All right, guys, last but not least, make sure from your golden tickets that you find in your Lucky Tackle Box, the 20th of every month on the Lucky Tackle Box YouTube channel, check that number. If they call it out, you can win a ton of different prizes. And if you don't see the live, that's generally a technical difficulty, and that means they're going to post these numbers to their Facebook account. Remember, guys, if you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below, and we appreciate you watching. We'll see you next time.